Without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Gabriel Escobar, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission in Belgrade, Serbia. I'm thrilled for two reasons. First, I have an attachment to the Balkans, having been born and raised in Kosovo. Second, I had the honor to report to Mr. Escobar as an undergraduate student intern at the US Embassy in Rome. Mr. Escobar taught me so much about the world and diplomacy, and his mentorship has meant the world to me all of these years. Mr. Escobar is a career diplomat in the Foreign Service who is currently serving his 5th tour in the Balkans. I cannot imagine anyone better suited to update us on US relations in the region and how the US and EU work together towards a stronger Europe. Welcome, Mr. Escobar.
Thanks, Tina. And I want to thank the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations and the PCFR board. And Keith, thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually as well. And Tina, especially to you, what people probably don't know about Tina was that, like she said, she was born in Kosovo. And less than 9 years later, she was a cleared American working in an American embassy. That's a tremendous story. And I really enjoyed working with you, Tina. It's rare for me to talk to a domestic audience. It's an honor and great opportunity for me. Most of my career I've spent talking to foreign audiences, but I'm glad to see that organizations like yours and audiences like you are interested in foreign affairs. At the State Department, we do believe strongly that American engagement in the world produces real gains for Americans at home. I'll add a little bit more about myself than Tina's introduction. I've been a member of the diplomatic service since 1993 and spent all of it, except for 4 years, overseas in places as diverse as Moscow, La Paz, and Peshawar, Pakistan. In those years, though, I spent 4 tours in the former Yugoslavia during the country's violent breakup. And now, 20 years later, I'm back. And it really is an interesting time to be in the Balkans and Serbia in particular. But as I go through this discussion, I really do want to make one thing clear. The image that most people have about Serbia, and a lot of what I'm going to discuss today, is really just a short period in Serbian-American relations. We this year are celebrating 140 years since the establishment of bilateral relations between Serbia and the United States. And throughout those 140 years, Serbia has been a very close friend and partner. It stood beside us in both world wars and suffered quite a bit as a result of its support for us against the Nazis. And Serbians, Americans have been big patriots and contributed a lot to America, particularly in the fields of science and medicine. And the most famous of these is somebody you may have heard of, Nikola Tesla, who is really a figure that bonds Americans and serves together. But for a brief period in the 90s, Yugoslavia and the United States stood opposed to each other. And during that period in the 90s, the Balkans was one of the central issues in our foreign policy. The war in Bosnia and later the war in Kosovo were pretty much nightly news items, and it shaped our vision of Yugoslavia for a generation. Probably most Americans, myself included at the time, had never heard of Bosnia or Kosovo before the war. But those 2 wars turned out to have a deep impact on the trajectory of our foreign policy and our foreign engagement afterwards. Now, 20 years later, I can look back and see how much it affected what we've done in other places, including Iraq and Afghanistan. But now, 20 years later, the Balkans again are one of our most important priorities in this administration's renewed focus on European security. And the reason it was so critical to our policy during that period and why it's again important has everything to do with the context of our European policy. I'm going to talk a lot about Europe. So in order to understand why Serbia is important and what our policy in the Western Balkans is and what we need to do here, it's important to understand that context. So most people already know that from the end of the Second World War to the end of the Cold War, our foreign and defense policies were focused very heavily on the security and viability of Western Europe. With the end of the Cold War and with all the other challenges that emerged in the period after the Cold War, a lot of people believed that our engagement with Europe would become less important. But in reality, our relationship with Europe became much more important, not less. And put it plainly, while most of our challenges are outside of Europe, almost all of our partners are inside of Europe, and not just bilateral partners. Some of our key, most important partners like Germany, France, and the UK. UK not so much in Europe anymore, but back in the post-Cold War period, they were an important part of Europe. It wasn't just those bilateral partners, but our two most important international organization partners, NATO and the EU, are centered in Europe. And the reason we have such close collaboration with Europe is that these alliances with NATO and the EU are built not just on common interests, but on shared values. And that makes the partnership stronger, deeper, more resilient, and ultimately not dependent on a single government or administration. The United States and Europe have more in common than any other two regions of the world, and that helps us have a common view and a common approach to global issues. And I have to say, it's pretty hard to overestimate or overstate that resilience, that mutual reliance. Because beginning after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the enlargement of NATO and later the enlargement of the European Union turned former adversaries into allies in a pretty dynamic way. And we did it peacefully. And I'm sure some of you remember the uncertainty that followed the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and later the Soviet Union. But we were able to engineer the best possible outcomes while avoiding our worst fears. In the course of leaving communism and transforming the structures of government of those countries, which were then some of the most oppressive in the world at the time, not a single Warsaw Pact country fell into civil war, chaos, or complete economic collapse. I mean, some did for a little bit, like Romania, but we're talking a matter of months, not years. And in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we didn't find that we had loose nuclear weapons. Russia didn't use its army to try to keep the Warsaw Pact together, or even prevent Germany from reunifying and staying in NATO, which was pretty surprising at the time. And when we ultimately gave those countries an opportunity, they all opted to join NATO and the European Union. And even among those, and once they joined the European Union, every country that joined became more stable, more democratic, and more prosperous, at almost no cost to the other members. And today, just the prospect of being a candidate country, not even being a member, has made countries, these aspirant countries, make critical democratic and economic reforms. And this enlargement of the transatlantic community, as we call it, is, in my opinion, one of the most significant historical developments of our generation. All of this was done through diplomacy. It wasn't done by force, which is even more amazing. And it was during that time when I started my career in Europe, and I became personally convinced, and I personally witnessed, that the combination of American and European engagement in the world was a good thing for America. And it was good for Europe as well, and ultimately for the world. When you look at that alliance today, NATO and our relationship with the EU is probably the most critical relationship in the world. With the notable exceptions of Russia and China, all of the world's most capable militaries are now part of NATO, and they're legally obligated to participate in our mutual defense. And it's not just the mutual dependence on the political and defense spheres. We're hugely reliant on each other economically. There's roughly about $3 billion a day in goods and services crossing the Atlantic. Tens of millions of jobs on either side of the Atlantic depend on that relationship. And together, we're the largest economic market in the world by far. Our foreign direct investment in Ireland alone is bigger than that of China. And our foreign direct investment in the Netherlands is bigger than all the BRIC countries combined. That's Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And those are the fastest growing, at one point were the fastest growing economies in the world. So it's these strong links that make the US critical to Europe and Europe critical to the United States. And in the post-Cold War era, as it was in the 20th century, the transatlantic community was again proving to be indispensable to global stability. And it continues to be. But in the midst of all of this good news and all these positive developments, we had the breakup of Yugoslavia. And even though many historians and experts will tell you that they could see the breakup coming, most governments didn't see it and they weren't prepared. And even the experts who predicted it, the historians and the political scientists, were shocked and horrified by the brutality of the war. Of the 6 original Yugoslav republics, Bosnia, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Slovenia, and Serbia, and then later Kosovo after its separation from Serbia, 4 of them experienced some form of armed conflict. In Bosnia alone, estimates are that between 5 and 8% of the population died in the war, and nearly half were displaced. And along with this massive human toll were some of the worst war crimes in Europe since the Holocaust. A lot of the population fled Bosnia and never returned. And that left a permanent hole in the country in terms of social life and economic life, which those countries still suffer. That country still suffers from today. Croatia and Kosovo suffered similar fates. And this war, to be honest, promised to undo all of the good stuff that we were experiencing in the rest of Europe. It promised it almost undid the promise of Europe free, whole, and at peace, as George H.W. Bush articulated. We couldn't be the community of values and prosperity that we aspired to be as long as these atrocities were taking place. And from 1992 to 2000, we struggled to find a way to end the wars in the former Yugoslav republics. And we used every diplomatic, political, and economic tool we had available at the time. The region was subject to arms embargoes, targeted bombing, sanctions, and what remained of Yugoslavia at the time was expelled from a lot of international organizations, including the UN. And to that, we added some new tools. We enacted the first sanctions that were targeted at individuals and specific entities controlled by individuals, and sanctions not directed at states. But while we did finally enact financial sanctions against the Yugoslav government, the majority of our sanctions during that period were directed at individual. And the digitalization of financial tools allowed that. We found that our government could reach out and turn off people's individual credit cards and prevent them from getting boarding passes. We enacted visa bans. And most importantly, we created a war crimes tribunal that eventually captured and tried every single person that was indicted. Some many years after the war was over, but justice came for almost everybody that was indicted in one way or another. In Bosnia, the war ended after a dynamic diplomatic push and a peace agreement named after the place where it was negotiated, the Dayton Peace Accords. That agreement saw the first ever deployment of NATO ground troops outside of its border. And along with the deployment was a deployment of this vast network of development and humanitarian personnel, doing everything from private sector development to refugee assistance, and from agricultural development to exhumations. And that was in 1995. For another 5 years, the president of what was left of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic, continued to undermine the stability of the region, including Bosnia, where Yugoslavia, at least in name, was still a guarantee of peace. Beginning in '98, we saw another pressure campaign and the start of another war in Kosovo. And in 1999, it culminated with a 60-plus day bombing campaign against Yugoslavia, including the bombing of Belgrade, where I am now. And some of those bombed out buildings are still up today in downtown Belgrade. But eventually, with the support of the European Union and the United States, the Democratic opposition won elections in 2000 and removed Milosevic from power. In June 2001, he was arrested and sent to the War Crimes Tribunal in the Netherlands. And I have a very clear memory of that period. And I remember being at the ambassador's residence for our annual 4th of July party that every embassy around the world hosts. And it was less than a week after the transfer of Milosevic to the War Crimes Tribunal. And since he was the person probably most responsible for the destruction of Yugoslavia, seeing him behind bars, my colleagues and I completely expected that the country was now, or the countries of the former Yugoslavia, were going to race to join the rest of the former Eastern Bloc, to be fully developed democracies and economies and integrate with the rest of Western Europe. Czechoslovakia did at the time, and later, as it split up, both Czech and Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, all of these countries were unqualified successes at the time. I had said that at the beginning that for a period, the Balkans were one of the most important foreign policy matters for us. But then for a while they weren't, and for a very simple reason. So that story I told you about being at the Independence Day celebration happened July 4th, 2001. I left Belgrade and I got to Washington, September 5th, 2001. And then less than a week after, the 9/11 attacks happened. And within the space of 60 days, our entire national focus shifted completely. Our entire defense, diplomacy, intelligence, and law enforcement communities shifted to the war on terror. And for nearly 15 years, that was our most important, all-consuming foreign policy challenge. And the Balkans almost didn't make it onto the agenda. And it really is the question of attention span or bandwidth or interest. It's really a question of resource limitations. The United States is only 4% of the world's population. Our military is less than 1.5 million active duty troops. And with all the military commitments we have around the world, in Korea and Europe and other places, and considering that only about a third of what's left is deployable, with another third getting ready to deploy and another third coming back from deployment to rearm and recuperate, that didn't leave us a lot of leeway or a lot of resources. It's another reason why we need allies, by the way. Plus wars cost money. And during that whole period, especially in the period between 2008 and 2009, we needed the money for the stimulus and bailout packages in the United States to get us over what was at the time the worst economic crisis that we had seen in modern times. We just didn't have the capacity to be everywhere. But in the meantime, a lot of the diplomatic tools that we developed in the Balkans, including the rapid deployment of civilian personnel alongside military troops, became the norm in Iraq and Afghanistan. I myself served 3 times in Iraq and once in Pakistan as part of this effort. And most of us, and many of us initially, were chosen to deploy to Iraq, not because we were experts on the Middle East, but we had become experts on running operations in war zones in the Balkans. The financial sanctions that we created to pursue war criminals and their networks were deployed against our development programs, which had been developed for the Balkans, were readapted to be used in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. But in the meantime, the Balkans didn't move as quickly or in the direction that we had hoped. Our aspirations, and their aspirations for European membership weren't met. Economic development didn't happen across the region. Multi-ethnic reconciliation didn't happen, and in some cases it regressed. And most importantly, a lot of the people who were present during the start of the war in Yugoslavia and who failed to stop it, or at worst, people who were complicit in the breakup of Yugoslavia, were still in power in many places. And what was most sad to me was that some even concluded that while Dayton was effective in stopping a brutal war, it cemented the ethnic-based politics in Bosnia and blocked reconciliation since its implementation. I still believe that, having lived in Bosnia in the immediate post-war period, that Dayton was a tremendous tool in stopping one of the worst atrocities in Europe. But I do see how it could be seen as an obstacle. So 20 years later, beginning with the end of the last administration and carrying into the new administration, we're seeing a new emphasis on the region. And this administration in particular has made it a point to signal that strengthening our relationship with Europe is one of the key foreign policy priorities. And that actually is a return to our traditional foreign policy, which is the realization that without Europe, the United States is much weaker. But to keep Europe strong, we have to make better and faster progress in the parts of Europe that are not integrated into the European Union yet. And when I speak about the Western Balkans now, we don't speak really about the countries of the former Yugoslavia. Croatia and Slovenia are now firmly part of the European Union. So now we're talking about the countries in Southern Europe, which are geographically sandwiched between other European countries, but not part of it. Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Albania, and Bosnia. But within that group, Serbia is absolutely critical. For its neighbors, Serbia was the source of a lot of the instability in the 90s. It participated in every conflict in the region, either directly or by proxy. The majority of the victims in the region were non-Serbs at the hands of Serbs. And that's why even though the War Crimes Tribunal indicted Bosniaks, Croats, and Kosovar Albanians, the majority were Serb. And many of Serbia's neighbors still worry about its ability to disrupt the region. And today, Serbia still has that capacity, although not necessarily the intent or the aim to destabilize its neighbors, but it has the capacity. It's the largest country within the Western Balkans 6. It's got 7 million inhabitants compared to less than 2 million in Kosovo and less than 700,000 in Montenegro. Serbs are the largest ethnic group in the region, and a lot of the citizens of Bosnia, Montenegro, and Kosovo are ethnically Serb, and they look to Belgrade frequently for political direction. Serbia's GDP is 50 billion, which is nearly as big as the other five put together, which is 59 billion. And it's also one of the fastest growing economies in the region and in Europe. And there's no reason to believe that within a decade, it'll overcome the other five in terms of aggregate GDP. Serbia also has the most capable non-NATO military in Southern Europe. And those forces are directed at its neighbors. Therefore, our best hope for lasting peace in the region is to anchor Serbia in the community of democratic countries. That is, to bring Serbia to the European Union for all the reasons that I mentioned before. That's Serbia's goal, and we support it. Unfortunately, European Union membership is not as straightforward as it was before. To start with, the EU is recovering from the blow of Brexit. It's also facing the challenges of democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland. And COVID has damaged the economy of Europe, and especially of its largest countries. So right now, the appetite for enlargement isn't as great as it was. At the same time, a lot of the aspirant countries in the Western Balkans haven't made much progress on the criteria needed to successfully close their membership requirements, mostly in the rule of law. And Serbia has an additional unique problem in that it doesn't recognize Kosovo, and resolving that issue is a requirement for European Union membership. There are some bright spots, though, surprising bright spots. I think the most important but overlooked development in this part of the world has been the emergence of Serbia as an economic power over the last 20 years. In just a quarter century, Serbia's gone from war, isolation, hyperinflation, and sanctions to one of the most stable, sustainable, diversified, and rapidly growing economies in the region with very low inflation. And you can't overstate that growth. In just 20 years, Serbia's economy grew 7 times, and it continues to accelerate. When I arrived in Belgrade 20 years ago, the effects of the emergence of socialism, of the country emerging from socialism, and years of sanctions and war were pretty evident. And today, Belgrade has a vibrancy that's reminiscent of Budapest or Prague in the 90s. It's an impressive development. And unlike most of the region, Serbia's dealt well with both the public health and economic aspects of COVID. The economic growth has allowed the Serbian president to stop relying on nationalist messages that had been popular in this part of the world for the last 30 years in favor of economic development as an electoral strategy, and it's worked for him. And it's allowed a level of market, this economic development has allowed a level of market integration between Serbia and Europe that makes its path to the EU almost irreversible. And even though Serbia is farther along the path, at least this particular government, is further along the path of post-war transformation, it's not the only one. There's a new government in Montenegro that for the first time since 1992 is led by a party other than the one that's led Montenegro for the last 30 years. And Kosovo is in the midst yesterday, their elections, in the midst of emerging from 2 decades of leadership by parties that were formerly part of the Kosovo Liberation Army. If these political and economic trends could continue, we could see the emergence of a new political landscape, which could help us heal the region and help us wrap up the outstanding tasks remaining from the war. And we want to speed it up. Our policy in Serbia and the region as a whole is to get them to join the European Union. It's Serbia's stated goal and it's our preferred policy outcome. But getting there will require us to overcome 3 major obstacles. First, we need to make sure that the region resolves all the outstanding issues remaining from the war, particularly the question of borders. There are still politicians 30 years, 20 years later, that continue to let their voters believe that border changes are possible, and they probably aren't. The countries of the region aren't likely to come to a mutually agreed deal on territory swaps, and the international community, quite honestly, isn't likely to engineer boundaries to produce countries based solely on ethnicity, not in Europe. The better option is for citizens of the region to have individual civil and democratic rights protected, regardless of where they live and regardless of whether they belong to the majority or the minority ethnic group where they live. But it would help if they had the additional protection of European institutions. And when I talk about the border issues, for Serbia, it means mostly the Kosovo issue. Serbia still doesn't recognize Kosovo. It hasn't signaled that it will. But at some point, and we can maybe in the question and answer period discuss why Kosovo independence was a better option for Serbia than any other option. They need to resolve that issue before they can join the European Union. For now, that issue is being mediated by the European Union. And the EU is in the lead because in the end, the EU can offer them something we can't, which is membership in the European Union. We support that, however, through a lot of other different initiatives. The previous administration worked very hard to conclude a series of commitments on economic integration between Serbia and Kosovo. And those commitments will provide confidence building measures that we can move toward political settlement. We'd like to go even further. We'd like to see the entire zone, the entire Western Balkans 6, form a free trade bloc among themselves as they move toward greater integration with the European Union and ultimately membership. So that's our first challenge, is the regional aspect. The second one is the broader regional aspect. That is, we need Serbia and the rest of the region to get moving on implementing the requirements for their European Union candidacy. And this is actually harder than the first one. Over the past few years, Serbia and its neighbors haven't done much to make progress on these requirements, particularly with regard to the rule of law. Political diversification, corruption, judicial independence, and media freedom are all lacking here. We're working closely with our EU partners to address this. And in the last 2 decades, we've provided nearly $1 billion in assistance to try to get them there. And we continue to do that. We still provide about 30 million a year in civilian assistance to Serbia alone. And this assistance helps train prosecutors, judges, police. It's created one of the most effective e-government programs in the region. We've partnered with civil society organizations and humanitarian organizations to strengthen democratic institutions and independent media. And we still continue to provide assistance to people who remain displaced from the wars of the 90s. I do have to add that that assistance, it doesn't just help Serbia. It's also creating opportunities for American companies. A strong judicial system, easier registration, and transparent legislation have led to a better investment climate and a fairer market for American companies. And then there is that one last long-term challenge. The Balkans are the subject of great power competition. Both China and Russia see the Balkans as both targets and platforms to challenge the US and the EU for primacy in the region and to underline our alliances. And while Serbia and Russia have long had brotherly relations due to a shared Orthodox and Slavic tradition, that partnership and the beginnings of the partnership with China actually began in the 90s when Serbia was looking to both countries as counterweights to the US, UK, and France in the Security Council. But long after the wars ended, Serbia continues to rely on both of them for veto power. And in exchange, Russia has pressured Serbia into ceding energy infrastructure to Russia. It's created a dangerous energy dependence. Russia is the source of huge disinformation in this country and fuels the corruption inside of Serbia. And China has become increasingly aggressive in its efforts to trap the countries of the region through debt for infrastructure swaps that could leave these countries indebted to China for a long time. And both have worked hard to draw Serbia into exclusive trade agreements that would preclude them from fully joining the EU. And Russia in particular would not like to see Bosnia and Serbia join NATO. So based on all this, it's clear why our policy of bringing Serbia and its neighbors into the EU is more critical than ever. But we're confident that the populations of the countries and the governments of the region understand why they need to be part of the Euro-Atlantic community. And it's, like I said, a community to which they've historically always belonged. And we're also confident that Europe understands this. But to close, this is really just a roundabout way of making the point I made at the top of the discussion, that Serbia and the United States and the countries of the region in the United States have always been traditional allies, except for a very difficult period in history. Even though we've got a long way to go to, especially in Serbia, to reach the full potential and to overcome the lingering mistrust, I'm pretty optimistic that we'll end up back in that place of friendship and partnership. And with that, I'll stop. And Keith, I'll turn it over to you for questions.
Thanks, Gabe. That's wonderful. So as Tina's just posted, please put your questions into the chat for us, and I will do my best to relay them. We do have one that came in, I think, while you were speaking. I don't know if you can see the chat as well, Gabe. Someone just, okay, that's fine. Casey Douglas just was sort of interested in the distinction between sanctions. I guess the question is, there's a difference between sanctions and requirements, right? I guess thinking about those incentives and those incentives to join EU sort of thresholds that are being placed. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that's being read by Serbian politicians and
Sure.
public? Do they see that distinction?
Well, I'd have to say that Serbia is not the subject of sanctions anymore. There are still individuals within Serbia, mostly former leaders and former financiers of the regime, that are still under sanctions, but overwhelmingly Serbia is not subject to any sanctions by the US or Europe. But what they are subject to is their EU candidacy has certain chapters that they have to close. I actually don't know how many chapters. I think it's 40 plus. And they cover everything from environment to market harmonization. But to be honest, the really difficult ones for Serbia are the ones about rule of law. Despite all of the good news about Serbia's economy, what Serbia is experiencing right now is a disturbing concentration of power in one party, in one family, and one individual who is the president. And so it's hard to get somebody, a party and a structure that benefits tremendously from corruption and non-transparency to close chapters on anti-corruption and transparency. But without it, there is no opportunity for them to join the European Union. And as long as they're not part of the European Union, there are economic costs in not direct economic costs that are imposed by the governments, but economic costs of not being part of a broader union, which every one of your neighbors are part of. And I'll give you one clear example. So during COVID, the European Union needed only one trial for the vaccine and one approval for each vaccine. That was good for every member of the European Union, but it wasn't good for Serbia because Serbia is not part of that unit. So Serbia had to redo all the trials and redo all of the approvals for every vaccine that came in. And when you have something like that, there are a lot of companies in Europe and American companies that say the 7 million people of Serbia is just not worth it. It's not worth the additional regulation for just that. So there are some huge incentives, both imposed and implicit in not closing chapters. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I think so. And then we have another question coming from Sam Richardson, which is about public opinion. And I guess I'm going to rephrase it slightly. Has confidence in democracy in Serbia followed the same path as it has elsewhere? In other words, is there still sort of a deep core of confidence in democratic institutions, especially when watching what's happened, let's say, in the US most recently, but perhaps also, let's say, in Hungary and Poland within the EU?
That's an excellent question. And it really is a great question. And the reason is, yeah, part of the reason why there's not a lot of domestic political pressure on reform is that a lot of Serbian citizens doubt the benefits of European Union membership. And part of it has been a concerted effort in terms of politicians who speak out against the European Union and a lot of the Russian misinformation. But there's a lot of EU skepticism, and a lot of it, I would say a certain amount of it is actually warranted because the European Union over the past decade has really changed moved the goalposts. So initially it was by country and you close chapters and then you're done. Now they're saying you close groups of chapters and you have to close them all at once, and you could actually be graded and have to reopen them again after a certain period. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite among the big European countries for greater enlargement. And then, also they do see some of the democratic backsliding in their neighborhood. Ironically, they don't look to the United States, particularly what's happening in our political system, mostly because there's so many more examples in their neighborhood. When you talk about Orban or Poland or Ukraine or others, that have a greater impact on them than ours do. But there is a tremendous amount of Euroscepticism, and NATO skepticism is, I would say, it's not even skepticism; it's hostility. So I don't ever imagine that we'd get to a point where we discuss NATO membership with this generation.
Thanks. So a few questions coming in now. I'm going to pick and choose. One was one that I had as well. You flagged that recognition of Kosovo is just seems so hard for leaders and potentially the public as well. What would it take? What do you see as the pathway for Serbia to take this step?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, Kosovo was that decision on Kosovo was a tough one. But when we looked at when the negotiators looked at all the options, which was incorporating Kosovo directly back into Serbia and giving the people of Kosovo an equal vote, that would mean that roughly every fourth, every third vote would be Albanian, which, given the political context of Serbia at the time, was impossible. There could have been an option for autonomy, but even with that autonomy, the initial option that the Serbs gave was that Kosovo Albanians couldn't vote in elections, which would mean that 2 million people in the center of Europe wouldn't have the right to vote. For Europe, that was unacceptable. We thought about a confederation like Bosnia, but by that time, Bosnia was already showing the strains of two strong entities and a weak government that didn't behave like a state. So the other option was some sort of phased independence where Kosovo would have to close its own chapters as it moved toward full independence. But for a lot of Serbs who had lost every engagement that they had ever participated in Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, and then Kosovo, it seems like an additional humiliation by the West, and they phrase it that way. So I can imagine that there might be some outcomes. I mean, people have floated territorial swaps with northern Kosovo, which is mostly Serb, being traded for southern Serbia, which is mostly Albanian. But it opens a can of worms in terms of what happens in North Macedonia with its Albanian population, or Bosnia with its Serbian population. So the better option is to resolve the question through membership in the European Union, so that eventually it doesn't matter where you live, you're all living in Europe. The problem is getting there. I can imagine, and I don't want to speak for the European Union, but it would involve an agreement with a long period of implementation that would end the day the recognition would occur the day they both enter the European Union together. To me, that's probably the most likely and most one that most people would be willing to accept here. There'd be some other things about associations for Serbian municipalities in Kosovo and some sort of special Vatican-like status for the Serbian Orthodox Church, which traces its roots to Kosovo. But beyond that, it will be a difficult political option for Serbia.
Thanks. Go back to this one back up here. So a question from Stephen Rodis. So you mentioned that economically Serbia is thriving right now. And the question is, how is that happening given some of the restrictions that you pointed out, the exclusion or the non-integration into the EU market? So what is the basis of Serbian business success right now?
That's a good question. And there's a lot of it, a lot of reasons. So for one, it's a country that doesn't depend on a single sector like Montenegro or Croatia with tourism. It doesn't depend on international assistance at all, or remittances like Bosnia or Kosovo. And it has a lot of inherent advantages. It inherited a lot of the infrastructure, particularly scientific, agricultural, and educational that Yugoslavia had. And Yugoslavia had a great educational system. But it is close to Europe, and it does have some elements of free trade agreements with the European Union, not full, but a lot of it. Relative to its neighbors, particularly to Germany, Austria, and some others, it's got low cost of labor and very good, highly educated labor. It's got good infrastructure and good connections, road, rail, and air to Europe. The problem is that a lot of it is manufacturing for Europe, and it may reach the limit of its growth potential if it doesn't integrate faster. And the other problem is, because a lot of it is manufacturing and agriculture, we're seeing a tremendous brain drain leaving Serbia. You do have quite a few people who are well qualified, and they find opportunities elsewhere. But for now, it seems to be working.
So a couple of questions that I'll group. It's really about it's a sort of question for all foreign service officers. There are moments in US policy that must make your life difficult. So the two observations that people pointed out, one, as you pointed out, you can still see the traces of US bombing and destruction in Belgrade, and a sort of, it's possible for Serbian citizens to ask questions about war crimes and responsibility coming out of those times. Yeah. And then a second question, which relates more to the more recent US policy, the difficulties of advocating for rule of law, non-corruption, when there are cases against a US administration, which seem to indicate that that administration has been not necessarily walking the talk.
I get the point of that. And look, I'll tell you one thing. Yeah, it is difficult sometimes when you disagree personally. And you don't have to disagree with the administration to disagree with the policy. I had friends in the State Department who were big supporters of the former President Clinton, who resigned because of his inaction on Bosnia. And there were a couple of cases of that. And I also later had friends who resigned over the Iraq War. But as a public servant, ultimately, you're serving the people, and it's not the administration that made the decision; it's the people that made the decision. So elections do have consequences, and if that's the policy that people vote for, even in our case, where you can have an electoral college win, that is the legitimate result of an election. That administration has the right and the duty to implement the policies on which it ran. And we as public servants have to recognize that the commander-in-chief and the chief executive of the United States requires a level of professional and constitutional loyalty. That said, I wouldn't use the bombing of Belgrade as an equivalent on war crimes. I know that here they call it war crimes, but there's a difference between bombing an infrastructure and doing it at night with precision weapons after you've told people to clear out, versus trying to maximize civilian casualties, as some of the paramilitary groups in the region did. I'm not saying specifically Serbian, but there are a lot of paramilitary groups which did specifically try to maximize civilian suffering. That's a war crime. Combatant action, trying to minimize even the collateral damage to military lives is something that's well within the confines of the rules of war. But with regard to the question of corruption and including in our government, I would say that the bright side of that is the fact that you can have independent journalists raise the questions of administration, corruption, or conflicts of interest. And you can have courts that will react independently. In fact, when we were talking about Serbia's inability to move on rule of law issues, one of the things that the European Union has said is that in Serbia, if you belong to the party, you have the ability to stop investigations, to stop judicial prosecutions, and to run out the clock on the statute of limitations by keeping judges from hearing your case. That's the kind of thing that is quite different than having a politician repeatedly accused and maybe even eventually convicted of corruption.
Thanks. I appreciate that answer a lot. That's sorry. Question from my colleague Steve Bertolden. In terms of great power rivalry in particular, could you review the question of public health and vaccine availability in the Western Balkans, both coming from Western vendors and Russia's Sputnik vaccine?
Yeah. I think the better example is Chinese Sinopharm. Sputnik was small in number. It was a little bit quicker than Pfizer and AstraZeneca. I've actually had one Serbian scientist tell me the reason it was quicker is because it was stolen and then not tested. But those have come in small amounts. But the real, I think the real long-term great power competition is China, and that's China around the world. And what China did in terms of providing PPE specifically to Serbia, because Serbia is still their target and still their most welcoming platform, they provided them an amount that wasn't matched anywhere else in Europe, and they delivered initially 1 million vaccines at a time when Pfizer delivered 19,000. So China clearly has the capacity to use that kind of vaccine diplomacy, but it's not just vaccine diplomacy. They do it with infrastructure. We were very happy to help an American company, Bechtel, win $1 billion infrastructure contract, and that was after years of having lost all of them to China through non-transparent or no bid tenders. So China is very, very alluring to developing countries, particularly countries that don't have financing or countries that are in need of just about anything and will take just about anything. But in return, there's always a quid pro quo. And in this particular case, we don't know what all of those infrastructure agreements are because China insists that they be classified. These are public contracts. China insists that they be classified as state secrets. And then we're not sure how much the debt is and what the conditions on that debt are either. But it's at least 7 billion, which is about a seventh of the Serbian economy. That's just their Chinese debt. So China is very aggressive, and I would have to say very successful. And it will continue to be a challenge.
So these questions, I'm going to bundle two questions, but they're about very different forces, but they're both about other factors as well as the great power, Russia, China, the US, EU. So one question is whether Islamic extremism is still a force in the region and still poses a challenge. And a separate question, I'm not joining that to this, but a separate question is about the influence of organized crime networks, of course, with a vested interest in maintaining a lack of rule of law and sort of maintaining this space of outside the EU. So how you're dealing with those two potential threats?
Well, the first one's an easier one. Serbia doesn't have an extremist problem, but prior to my tour in Serbia this time around, I served as the deputy in Iraq as well. And what was amazing was, as we were picking up ISIS fighters on the ground, the ability of ISIS through the internet to be able to recruit globally. I mean, we had people from Fiji, we had people from Costa Rica, and we had people from the Balkans, but they were in small numbers. And generally, there is a good enough intelligence network around Europe that they can track them, not completely, but fairly well. And Serbia does participate in some of those structures. And for Europe, a lot of the threat was domestic. It was homegrown. It wasn't migrants. And when we talk about the migrant issue, they tend to use Serbia and the region as a transit point and not as a final destination. So the threat isn't quite as bad as it was a few years ago. During the initial invasion of Iraq, there was a tremendous amount of radicalization among Islamic communities, even in Bosnia and Kosovo and southern Serbia. We don't see that as much anymore. Organized crime, however, is it's a great point. It is one of their biggest threats. Organized criminal structures have infiltrated political parties, and those political parties have made decisions about public finances, about public prosecution, and about judicial reform that are not good for the country as a whole. Mostly, they haven't made any decisions. But it's not just in Serbia, it's in the whole region. North Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia, and Montenegro all have deep, entrenched organized criminal networks that connect all the way from Colombia all the way to Russia and to the United States. The interesting thing is, I served in Bolivia at one point, and when they would do drug busts, they would pick up drugs in the quantities of metric tons. Here, it's in the kilos. But one of our DEA folks here point out that almost every transaction that the Colombian cartels do in Europe and the United States involves in some way, shape, or form the Balkans, either to move the money, to use their networks, or to hide the money. So they are. It is a very powerful force, and by closing some of these chapters and making some of these reforms, we hope we can put a stop to some of it, but it'll be around for a long time.
Thanks. So, Tina, do we have time for one more? We've got a few more. I'm going to have to pick.
Yeah,
All right.
one more.
You really prompted a lot of questions, which is always a sign of a great discussion. I'll just flag that the book group is reading George Packer's book on Richard Holbrooke later this week.
Interesting.
And obviously someone who's had a great impact on the country, but on the region. And I heard you mention now Albania and North Macedonia. A couple of people in the chat have suggested that the US might creatively, obviously Serbia is the big dog in the house, but by funneling resources to some of these other countries may have an indirect impact on Serbian policymaking. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Clearly, just as Serbia is the largest ethnic group in the region, Albanians are not far behind. They have enormous influence in Montenegro, in Kosovo, in North Macedonia. And we're lucky that we have a great relationship with Albania. They're an eager NATO partner and an eager aspirant for the European Union. And we do see that as a possibility. And in fact, the president of Serbia believes that the path to regional stabilization is greater integration with Albania, and he's pursuing that. And the free trade agreement that I talked about, that we believe would help spur broader integration and greater multi-ethnic reconciliation, initially started in discussions between Serbia and Albania. So we do count on Albania to be a stabilizing force in the region, and it is very much so.